Good morning. It is 7:03 and just thought I'd jump on a little early, send the notifications that I'm on and ask you to join me in this sacred space. I want to thank all of you who have been hanging with me through this series on trauma. I'm not going to lie, it has been really therapeutic for me in the sense as I'm just very transparent. I'm working on my own trauma, working on just getting those last roots out of myself, or even if I don't get the roots out, really just understanding where the trauma, how it impacted me, where it comes from, and how I've been carrying it, not just in my mind, but in my body, how I physically and emotionally and mentally, even financially, have been using trauma and the faulty coping mechanisms that comes with it. So it's been a journey. And I hope that this process has been a journey for you too. I hope that as we talk about trauma, that we shine a fresh light on it, that we're not using it as a way to just beat up on ourselves or beat up on others, but really use it as an opportunity to see how trauma can impact our day-to-day life, how we carry it in our bodies, and just how impactful trauma has been and how we're still coping and dealing with it today. And today we're going to talk about the complexities of trauma and grief. They're two separate things, but when they're together in an instant, it can be paralyzing. So let's just jump in. Grief and trauma both describe powerful things felt after the loss of a loved one, relationship, etc. We feel in grief or a painful event like trauma. Grief and trauma can sometimes intersect, like in the case of a sudden or violent traumatic loss, but the two are two distinct, different emotional experiences. Not all grief involves trauma, and not all trauma involves grief. Trauma is primarily the fear and the sense of the threat, while grief is about the loss and its impact. So they may cross-section each other, but they're two separate emotions. But when you have a sudden and traumatic event, sometimes they come together. However, when trauma and grief become unified, it becomes a complex, intertwined experience with potential for significant overlap and unique challenges that greatly impact a person's mental health. Trauma can significantly impact the grieving process, leading to complicated grief, while grief itself can be a traumatic experience, especially when the loss is sudden or violent. Often, traumatic experiences can lead to two forms of grief. First type of grief. Good morning, Miss Patricia. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you always. The first is what we call complicated grief, also known as persistent complex bereavement disorder. That's in therapy. Complicated grief is defined as the persistent feeling of sadness that causes functional impairment for at least a year after the loss. Complicated grief, in essence, is a more prolonged and intense form of grief that for many people may be associated with trauma, like losing a spouse or a child. Instead of the grief becoming manageable with time, people with complicated grief will continue to find that grief impairs your day-to-day life, sometimes for years. And so with complicated grief, it's a prolonged essence of grief. It's prolonged feelings of grief where it impacts for over a year. That's the clinical diagnosis. But it impacts your day-to-day life. So if there's a sudden loss of a child, or I even like to say complicated grief when there's like some type of natural disaster where and we're going to talk about that too, where you are involved in a flood and you've lost a child, and now there's all this other complicated grief that just keeps prolonging it through that day. But yes, it can be very intense. But complicated grief lasts for a year, sometimes for years. Delayed grief is trauma may initially suppress or delay the grieving process. In some cases, individuals may be so focused on coping with the aftermath of the traumatic event that they don't fully engage with the grief till later. For example, when someone survives a natural disaster that results in the loss of their home, and the lives of some of their family members may initially have happened, they're going to be an initial shock, and they only process the emotional impact of the loss of the family, and after the acute phase of trauma is ended. So here's what when I was dealing with my own delayed grief, I've shared this before. When my father died, I was so busy. I had a father to bury. My mama had just had hip replacement surgery. She was in a skilled nursing facility recovering. I didn't have the time to deal with the death of my father. I had to plan a funeral. I had to make sure my mama was straight. I had to make sure my nephew still got back and forth to school. I mean, I didn't have time to grieve. And so my grief for my father was delayed. And it was delayed for years. I really didn't deal with the death of my father until my mama died. Because that delay. Has that ever happened to someone? You find yourself in a stressful situation, because again, we talked about what trauma does is it elicits that fight or flight response. And I'm a fighter. And so my goal is I'm going to fight through it. I'm going to do whatever I got to do. I'm going to focus in on this thing and get this done. But it leads to that delayed grief. And when that delayed grief comes, sometimes it feels like a flood. It's overpowering because all of it comes back. And I remember there were phases right after my mom died that I felt like I was drowning in that delayed grief, just overwhelmed by it. So whether it's complicated grief or delayed grief, they both impact each other. So let's talk about how it works. So we're going to talk about how trauma influences grief. The first way that trauma impacts grief is amplified emotional challenges. Trauma survivors may experience grief with a higher intensity and duration past the traumatic experience. So once you're looking at that grief and that trauma, and it's heightened, you're super hyper. We talked about that last week. You're hypervigilant. We talked about this earlier. Complicated grief. Trauma can lead to prolonged and intense grief reactions, including persistent yearning and difficulty accepting the loss and avoidance of reminders. Has it ever happened to anybody? When you're dealing with that complicated grief, you don't go to the places that you used to go. Things that remind you of that person, you avoid. Distorted grief reactions. Trauma can distort normal grieving processes, leading to symptoms like intrusive thoughts, feelings of guilt, and avoidance behaviors. When someone is experiencing that trauma, like the loss of a child, or just there's traumatic events associated with their grief, sometimes we feel like it's our fault. What if I had gotten there sooner? What if I had told that person not to go? What if I had done this? What if I had done that? And that complicates our grieving process because we allow those intrusive thoughts to dominate us, and then we become isolated. We get alone, and I say this all the time. The enemy, the devil, whoever you call him, loves nothing more to get you alone so they can beat the crap out of you. And those intrusive thoughts then become your primary focus. You're like, if I had just done this, if I had done that. I went through that when my father died. Just want to be transparent. My father I had been staying with my father. And the one night I didn't stay, he fell out of the bed. And I beat myself up for years. Because I was like, what if I had just stayed? I was tired and I went home. But what if I had stayed? And so that distorted my grief reaction, that trauma. those intrusive thoughts. Traumatic grief. When grief is intertwined with trauma, individuals may experience a sense of powerlessness, physical pain, sleep disturbances, and anxiety related to the loss. So if there's someone that was in a car accident, I knew someone when I was doing therapy, someone who was having this traumatic grief because they was in a car accident and the person in the car with them had passed. And so they were, every time they closed their eyes or they would get in traffic, it would just be this traumatic physical pain being in traffic. It brought back the experience every single time. And co-occurring conditions. Trauma survivors may experience PTSD, anxiety, depression, along with those grief reactions. So when we have the complications of trauma and grief, we're going to experience it. We may experience some of those what we call comorbidities, co-occurring conditions like PTSD, anxiety, depression. So what's grief's impact on trauma? When you're having grief and it's trauma, grief can have interference with those PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder. Grief can also exacerbate, I can't even say that word. Grief can heighten or trigger PTSD symptoms, particularly in cases of a traumatic loss. Challenges in healing. The presence of traumatic grief makes it harder for an individual to move forward and heal from the loss of the trauma, from both the loss and the trauma. So when you have a grief, when you are dealing with grief and there's a traumatic experience, it's harder. The challenges in healing are harder. So when you've had trauma, you may be an abuser, you may be a survivor of sexual, emotional, physical abuse, and then that abuser dies. There's a sense of you feel as if you're dealing with that trauma, but there's a grief that takes place in there. Not that you're overwhelmingly sad of the person dying, you may be, but that sense of loss of your childhood, that sense of loss of all the things that could have been that this traumatic event took from you. I always like to say that when people are dealing with trauma and loss, because again, it's the traumatic event of losing someone you love is difficult. But there is a loss that comes when we lose someone we love of hopes and dreams. I'm just going to say this right now because it's on my heart. When someone loses a child, unless you've lost a child, never say you understand, because it's a different type of grief. Because this is where that traumatic grief comes in. Because there's a process of where not only do you lose the physicalness of that child that you talked to, that you loved, that you birthed, that you raised, but now there's the loss of the dream. There's the loss of the grandkids, or there's loss of who's going to take care of me when I get older. Those are real, legitimate things that people go through as part of this complicated grief when you lose someone. So I always want to just say that so we can be very mindful, because not everybody responds to grief the same, but we have to understand that when there's a traumatic grief and there's challenges in that healing, you can't expect everybody to respond, and everybody's grief is different. So, and then also there's that complicated mourning. The intense emotions associated with the trauma can make it difficult to process and integrate the experience of loss, leading to complicated mourning. Again, being someone, if you were abused or mistreated by your parents, that's complicated mourning, because you're the abuser. You loved your abuser. You cared for your abuser. So there's grief there because there was trauma in the relationship, but you love them. So it's complicated. And so you're dealing with these, and that makes it even harder on the process of healing from that grief and that trauma. So now that we know about trauma and grief, how do we manage it? How do we manage those times in our lives where grief and trauma are intertwined? I got some tips for us. Number one, seek professional support. Therapy, especially a trauma-informed therapy or cognitive or CBT, cognitive behavior therapy can be crucial for addressing both trauma and grief. Hello and happy Friday to you, Renee. I'm eventually going to make it to the porch. I love me some Renee. So again, this is where I want to emphasize, when you're dealing with the complications, when you're dealing with trauma and grief, I love you as a life coach. I love y'all and I want to be there for you, but this is therapy work. This is where a licensed therapist comes into play. Someone who is trained, on how to navigate through the complications of trauma and grief. Everybody might mean well, and I'm sure you have trusted friends and people that you can talk to. But when you're dealing with the intensity of trauma and grief and the complexity of those intertwined together, you're going to need someone professionally that can navigate that with you. So, yes, seek professional support. Find you a therapist who specializes in that. Number 2, build a support system. Connecting with supportive friends, families, or even a support group can provide a sense of community to reduce those feelings of isolation. I have given them a shout out before, but after my mom died, Alive Hospice continued to reach out to me. And they had a virtual support group. When I tell you that got me through many a days, it was so, I was a daughter who was dealing with the death of her mother. And there were women in there and men in there who were going through the exact same thing. And then, I was a caregiver for my mom. And so even though I miss my mom, there was this sense of me getting up at 4 a.m. and making sure she ate. And, that 24/7 care had been daunting. I was tired. So I felt guilty because I was able to go to bed. I couldn't sleep. Even though there were times when I was taking care of my mama, I was up all night because I never knew when she was going to call me. After she passed, I felt guilty. I felt guilty for falling asleep. And I had to process that. I felt guilty. So having a support system, this is where that supportive friend, that group comes in and works with you. After you get your professional support, find you a support system. Number 3, develop healthy coping mechanisms. Learning healthy coping strategies such as mindfulness, relaxation techniques, creative expression can often help manage those difficult emotions. And so healthy coping mechanisms is, I go to the gym. And again, I say it every week, I say it all the time, but because it's the truth. If custom made bodies had not been, you come into the gym, get your butt up and come to the gym. I'd probably gained every pound that I ever lost, and I would have been dealing with more intense, because the way that the trauma was setting up in my body, the way it was affecting my joints and my back and I was carrying it in my body. And just to be able to get to the gym and exercise some of that. Then I think about my friends, Renee and Kamika and Shanita, all my friends who constantly was like, hey, let's get out. Let's go do this. Let's do that. Or just the simple check-ins of, hey, how you doing? You're good. So, and then having those relaxation techniques, really learning to sit by myself. A moment of transparency here. One of the struggles I dealt with after my mom and dad and I was dealing with the complicated grief of my father was, who am I? Because I have been somebody's daughter for 50 years of my life, 50 plus years of my life. I was somebody's daughter. Now my parents are gone. Who am I? So it was that challenge of being able to sit by myself. It was a challenge to learn how to sit by myself, enjoy my own company. And then creative expression, keeping a journal. I love my journal. Keep a journal, paint, walk, exercise. I love Renee because Renee is so active in the community. She volunteers at FISC. She's active with her community. Find ways to express yourself. Find ways to be present with other people. Get outside yourself can help in dealing with the complicated emotions of dealing with trauma and grief. And lastly, respecting individual experiences. Recognizing that everyone grieves and copes with trauma differently is essential for providing effective and kind support and appropriate support. So again, not all trauma involves grief, and not all grief involves trauma. But when someone is experiencing it, good morning, Miss Anita. Y'all know how I feel about my auntie. Everybody jump in, say hey. Not everyone is going to go through the process the same. You know, some will cry and lay in the bed, and that's how they grieve. I remember watching when JFK Jr. died in that plane crash. His sister Carolyn went out and rode a bike, and people were like, "Oh my God, is she not grieving?" And I remember thinking to myself, we don't know if she's crying that whole time she's riding that bike. We don't know what she's doing. We don't know what Caroline Kennedy's doing. We know that she's lost. Talking about complicated grief. Not only did the Kennedys have this history of loss, but now she don't have her parents, and she lost her only brother. She's in this, I mean, she's got cousins and everything, but her immediate family is gone. So if her way of dealing with her grief after she found her brother had passed was riding a bike, we're not in a position to judge her. That was her healthy coping mechanism kicking in. That was how she coped. And so when we recognize that everyone grieves and copes with it differently, we put ourselves in a position as support people to be understanding and compassion. And we leave the door open for people to come to us and say, I'm struggling today. But if you're in a judgment position like, yes, ma'am, I will. Mommy, I'll definitely do that. Good morning to you too. When we respect individual differences, we allow the process for that person to heal. But not only that, something inside of us can heal too. Jump in the chat and let me know what you think about the complexities of dealing with trauma and grief. Have you ever been there? Are you there? If you are, reach out. If you need help in finding someone in your area that you can work with, let me know. I'm happy to tap into resources. I'm happy to navigate that process with you to find someone that you can talk to that's going to help, a professional person who's going to help you navigate through that. And also continue to reach out to your friends. And this is where a support system comes in. Reach out to me. If you're really dealing with that and you feel isolated and alone, please know that you're not. I want to give my 2 love notes. Oh, good morning, Miss Lisa, Crazy Mom Creation. Mwah, mwah, mwah. I sure miss seeing your beautiful face. I'm definitely going to come to Jersey. I'm going to do it. I will give my love notes. My first love note goes to, I'm asking for prayers for the family for Preston Bailey. He's my cousin, but he also leaves behind a devoted wife, a son, a sister, and numerous family members who loved him. His passing was sudden and unexpected. And I know that those who love him are going to be dealing with that complex grief and trauma. Preston used to send me daily devotions and prayers every day. I just got one from him. He passed on Tuesday, and I literally just got one on Monday. He was a really good person, and he was committed to his family and his community. I am grieving the loss of this beautiful spirit. We all should hope that when we pass, that people don't just miss our physical presence, but they miss the beautifulness of the spirit that we had. That is why it's so important to pour into people every day. So I want us to put Preston and his family on our prayer list and lift them up, and just lift my family, lift his cousins, lift his other ones in prayer. My second love note goes to Chris Pennick. She is the CEO and founder of the Grief Center. She's a grief and loss therapist. And if you need help dealing with trauma or grief, she is the perfect person to go to do it with you. So I'm going to put her link in here. I want you to please go and like and follow her page and her podcast. She is amazing. And so just having someone like her in your corner is amazing. Again, if you're dealing with grief and loss, Chris is amazing. The Grief Loss Center, amazing. And so I apologize for these tears. It's just, you had to know him. He was really good people. And when people take the time to pour into you, that's amazing. And there's a sense of honor when that comes. So he will definitely be missed. And today's reading comes from who? Morgan Richard Oliver. I have all her books. Y'all know how I feel about her. She's my favorite author. And this is her book, One Still Whisper. It's very appropriate for today. It's okay to mourn the version of yourself that you are no longer. The version of you, your mindset, and your normal have changed. But that doesn't take away from the fact that they existed. Whether the memories bring back pride or pain, look back with the eyes of purpose and see the seeds of wisdom they planted. Don't waste another moment wishing to be someone else or wanting to go back to who you once were. Embrace and love the person you are now and align yourself to become the person you were created to be. One small whisper, one still whisper. And I want to thank you today. We're going to follow up next week. Will be our last show for the month of August, and we're going to talk a little bit more about trauma, but how to kind of picking up on that, leaning into your purpose. Because even with traumatic events, even with everything that comes into our life, if we look at it through the lens of completeness and wholeness and moving us toward being our best selves, can serve a purpose. How can we lean into that purpose and move past grief and move past the traumatic events to become the best person, the best version of ourselves, and the person we were destined to be? It's going to be a great topic. I look forward to having that conversation. Meanwhile, I want y'all to know I love you. Take the time today to make sure you pour into somebody. Make sure you tell somebody you love them. Take the time to make sure you love yourself, because tomorrow's not promised. I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean it. If you love somebody, tell them today, because Lord knows, whether you're watching me live or later, I love all of you. All right? Hope everybody has a great Friday and a great weekend. Y'all be safe. Bye. My phone don't love me. What is happening? Y'all gonna get to stay with me a little longer, because I can't. My computer's frozen. My phone is frozen. Okay. Okay. There's no way to edit. Okay. Have a good day.